The former Conservative MP Harvey Proctor, who was convicted of gross indecency back in 1987, says he wants an investigation into the Metropolitan Police, who he says misled a judge. He stormed out of a TV interview earlier this week because he said impertinent questions were being asked and he wasn't being listened to. So I'm joined on the line now by David Henke. Hi David, welcome to the Politics Show.
Hello.
I understand you've worked with Kevin in the past on the old XRO News, or at least had some sort of connection. But can you just tell us, as a journalist, how did you first come to these child abuse allegation stories?
Well, actually, the child abuse allegation story came to me when someone who was in a dispute with the London Borough of Richmond came across information about a rather notorious bed and breakfast place called Elm Guest House, where it was alleged it worked on two levels. One, it was in the 1980s, at a time when being gay, people kept quiet about it, and that was perfectly consensual, but it was also suggested that children were taken there. And basically my source spent quite a bit of time digging around, and I started digging around about people who lived in the same road as where Elm Guest House was. And one or two of them, although they were a bit worried about saying it, they took quite a lot of tracing back, because we're talking about 20 or 30 years ago, but we managed to trace some who alleged that they had seen children being taken there, and also alleged that people rolled up in posh cars and were also using the place. And that's how I really started getting involved in investigating this. And it was it grew up from there. And following sort of inquiries were made, it became rather clear that a local children's home called in Grafton Close, long closed, was basically that there was suspicion that some of the children had come from there. The police launched not Operation Midland but Operation Fernbridge, and basically discovered that the person who ran the home was charged with a number of offences, and they discovered a priest who was now based in Norwich, of all places, a Roman Catholic priest, who was his friend, was also charged with a number of cases, and it was a successful conclusion because the priest was put away for 3 years. And what they found was that the main person who ran it died 2 weeks before he was due to appear at Southwark Crown Court and the trial to begin. But it came out afterwards that the man was a convicted paedophile who, once he left Richmond, was actually caught in Kent on similar offences, and the court were told about how people were taken to actually Bexhill-on-Sea, and also there were, unfortunately because the guy died, a charge couldn't be pursued that he was taking people to Elm Guest House. But nevertheless, what was disclosed was that the London Borough of Richmond's children's home at that time, that there were quite a number of children who were actually basically considerably at risk, and some of them had actually been either sexually abused or basically pursued by these people.
Now, I mean, so many questions there, crikey, yeah, a bit of a baptism of fire, but there's so many questions there, it's almost difficult to know where to start, but there was, I know, a list apparently produced about Elm Guest House of, and even though it was nobody ever said that this was a definitive list, it included many allegations of all sorts of people who'd gone backwards and forwards. Do you think there was actually any point in creating such a list when no one could ever be really sure how accurate it was?
Well, this is the trouble, and actually, what was quite interesting about all this is that basically, it was alleged to have been written or obtained by a woman called Carole Kasir, who was the joint owner of this rather disreputable bed and breakfast place, and which she ran with her husband. And the police at one stage arrested the husband, but he refused to cooperate in any shape or form. And basically they then released him and couldn't pursue this much further. But what was discovered, and I think partly in the system, there were some police officers on it, and it turned out that the police were trying to stake it out. And then there was an horrendous situation when they raided the place, but they only found one child there who was taken into care. The suspicion is that, he's now dead, the man who ran Grafton, they had contacted the man who ran this children's home, because it was the nearest to where Elm Guest House was, and alerted him that they might need it as a place of safety. What the police had done was actually alerted a paedophile that actually they were going to be raiding Elm Guest House, and I suspect the whole thing was covered up. The list is very, very, very difficult to know whether it was true or not, and this has been one of the sort of mysteries that's still not certain about who did use this house. There was another rather extraordinary thing, was when a separate investigation by dispatches into Cyril Smith asked the Met Police a whole series of questions, and the only thing the police confirmed was that Cyril Smith had visited Elm Guest House. And I thought they wouldn't have actually told a media organisation that was the case unless they had firm proof.
How sure have you been? Basic journalistic techniques of making sure you're standing stories up. This is not going to be an easy task as a journalist to do this kind of case. What sort of problems have you had over the years of looking into Elm Guest House and around this whole topic?
We have a lot of problems, actually. For a start, actually, if you were going to interview survivors and others, they have been damaged, actually, by their experience. So it's quite... and also, allegations against cabinet ministers coming from survivors, most people can't recognise, wouldn't know who was in the cabinet. If you think of the general public today, probably couldn't name the current government's cabinet, let alone a 7-year-old or a 9-year-old. And so basically, if you do this, you try and actually get evidence from people who are not abused, but have been witnesses to things like chasing people who were in the road where this place was, talking to my original source on what he had uncovered at the time, and try and build up a picture that will stand up information around it. And occasionally you get someone who, I did have in one case of Elm Guest House, luckily he was never taken there, but he basically escaped by the skin of his teeth from being abused, because his social worker spotted something was going on there and got him out. But you can only build this up by actually quite a lot of work, and you actually have the problem is, and this is the real core of the problem, that child sexual abuse, people go to great lengths who are involved to cover it up. They go to great lengths to basically try to prevent anyone really finding out, and they also, when faced with anything, completely deny it. And sometimes, actually, when there are other people, the other people who deny it are often their family, because they don't really wish to believe this, actually. The interesting case at the moment is, if you remember about Greville Janner, which is a whole separate issue, where there will eventually be some sort of inquiry by the Independent Child Sex Abuse Inquiry. His family, all his family, say it's all lies and so on. Yet, up to 30 people have alleged abuse. And also Henriquez, who, after all, is in the centre over criticising the Westminster paedophile ring, the way the police handled it and everything else, actually produced a report that is conveniently forgotten, where he said actually he thought, when he reviewed things, that Janner should have been, they should have actually raided Janner's house and arrested him about 5 years or so before he came to the attention of it. And actually you just have to try and piece together all this different information.
What about the recent conviction, David, of Carl Beech? A lot of people have pointed to an extraordinarily long sentence that he's got.
Yes, Carl Beech, appeared on the surface to be, a rare case of course, a lot of the abused people are not, without being too sort of dismissive of them, are not particularly well. Many of them are not well educated, and not, and I think the police thought that they had got someone who was articulate, who made a lot of really strong allegations, and they've come under criticism. Now, I must say, the one thing I think they should have done very early on, which now the Met Police admit they do, is actually basically taken his computer away. This is the problem for journalists investigating this. If, say, I didn't do the story at all, but a colleague of mine couldn't turn round to Carl Beech and say, I demand your computer and I want to go through it all, because he'd just say no. Only the police can do something like that. And I think because it involves so many prominent people, and because actually, frankly, the trial, he never produced any corroborative evidence. That was, I thought, extraordinary about it. I have a feeling that the general establishment thought, well, this was so grotesque in their view that that basically that's why he got such a long sentence. But he did get a proper jury trial and everything else on it. So.
Well, what do you make of David? What do you make of the? He's
obviously a very seriously damaged person, because certainly the allegations that have led to this furore, when they discovered he had made up other people and other things like that, sort of led to a very sort of stern view about the whole thing.
Well,
I don't think he helped himself by fleeing the country and hiding away in Sweden.
Well, I think the thing is, you've got damaged people, haven't you?
And I think this all went against him, which is why there's such a heavy sentence.
So, what do you make of the police's role here? Have they simply believed someone they should never have believed? Because the thing is, the message goes out, doesn't it, to survivors, is, you could end up like Carl Beech.
Yeah, this is the most damaging thing of the lot, because there's a great argument about whether the police should believe someone making allegations like this. The answer probably to that is that the police should listen to all this and should follow it up. And I notice even Henriquez, who is the most savagely critical of the Metropolitan Police and the way they obtain warrants and other things, actually does say in his report, when you read it, that if Scotland Yard has actually said, once they had this Carl Beech thing, oh, we're not in there, they're important people, you've alleged 3 kids were killed and all that, and they were murders as well as all that, and we're not going to listen to you at all or take any notice of it, they would have been in severe trouble the other way around for it being said, well, someone had come and made really serious allegations to the Met Police and no one had taken any notice of it. And the real danger in this is, and this is a danger by paedophiles and people who, frankly, believe that a lot of the child sexual abuse stuff is made up, is there's quite a lot of pressure for them to say, well, one, the police shouldn't believe them. 2, we should end up, if the police can't prove their allegations, and I've seen this on some of the wilder sort of websites, people saying, oh, well, they should immediately be prosecuted for perversion of the course of justice and put in prison. Well, actually, if you have that attitude, it's very convenient for paedophiles. If I come back to what I said before, it's done in secret, it's difficult to prove, and often you have to get outside people. And basically it would mean no one would dare go to the police and make an allegation, because they'd be worried they were going to be locked up if the police couldn't prove it, because the police can't always prove it all the time. I would say, actually, the interesting thing about the West, although the press has concentrated a lot on the Westminster paedophile ring, if you look at North Wales, where there were allegations dating from about the same time, and if you remember, Gordon Anglesey, what was a chief superintendent, was accused of being involved in this and sued Private Eye successfully for suggesting it. Because the National Criminal, the NCA agency, did a thorough job on it, he ended up being a jury convicting him, and other main people who ran homes in North Wales have ended up behind bars, and this is 30 or 40 years later, and that is not really much covered by the national press, because it's actually been an incredible success. It's the exact opposite to the Westminster thing, that people have come forward, and the same allegations have been made. I mean, people have, the kids who've made these are now well-grown men, years afterwards, or immediately accused of lying, making it up, wanting money, and all that. But in these cases, it's gone to the courts, and frankly, they've had a really good record of arresting people for historic child sexual abuse, and this is somehow glossed over at the moment.
Well, there's another enormous problem, David, and that is that it's the Crown Prosecution Service that brings these criminal prosecutions against these people, and yet we've seen some very close connections with the royals of both Jimmy Savile and a chap called Bishop Peter Ball. So it does make you wonder just how close this does come to the very top of the establishment, some of the cover-up.
Well, the Bishop Ball thing is really interesting because he got away with it. And when you read the report by the independent inquiry into this, it was only really the Sussex police, because nobody really believed it. And it also is a brilliant illustration of how paedophiles work, because what he did was, I mean, the Church of England has got a lot of antiquated structures, and also people at the top, going right up to the Archbishop of Canterbury. He created a sort of monastic order that wasn't really quite under the control of the church, where, with a group of other people who then were involved in, frankly, in paedophilia. And as a result, this was fairly hidden, and it was only really the forensic work of Sussex police that finally got him. And he had managed in between to convince the Archbishop of Canterbury, Prince Charles, and other people, Prince Charles even, made a duchy, a cottage available to him so he could live. And all these people, he basically got away with it because he was quite a sort of prominent figure, and at the same time sort of live figure that nobody believed it. And this is the danger of the whole thing. That, I mean, some people make out that paedophiles, well, they're all they might be teachers, social workers, priests, and others, but of course nobody important would ever be a paedophile. And this turns out to be, we can think of the number of cases, and even among MPs, I don't think there'd be anyone who would say that Sir Cyril Smith wasn't a paedophile who got away with it through his whole career.
One of the most litigious and most virulent people are having a go at the police recently, saying that they have done far too much for survivors and not enough for so-called paedophiles, who he says are not paedophiles, is Harvey Proctor. How does he fit into all this? Because I know back in the 1980s he was actually a convicted sex offender himself.
Yes, I mean, I was in Parliament in the 80s, just around this period of 87, and certainly he was to an extent. He was actually privately quite notorious. I mean, and actually he, after he was convicted, I mean, he would argue these days because they've lowered the age of consent, it wouldn't apply. But he actually lost his parliamentary seat over the whole business. I mean, he now says, well, I mean, if we go back to Carl Beech, we have to say that, that the allegations are decided by a court to be false, and he's now making a great big thing about the whole thing, saying the way he was treated and everything else. But what I think I would say about it is it was certainly in the 1980s, the practices, and I know of other MPs at the time, and one of them who's dead now, who basically, there were two problems really. Basically, one, to be gay in 1987 is not like being gay in 2019, and a lot of them covered it all up. And there was one MP whose wife didn't know for 22 years that he was gay, and he only came out because she spotted a story about Justin Fashanu, the footballer, who basically had a basically was quite a conflicted guy. I suddenly realised that there was a story about him in the national press which talked about him having a connection with a South Coast MP, and the wife on that night suddenly realised that he was leading a completely different life to the normal life. I mean, he had 2 children and everything else with her, and confronted him overnight, and he then admitted, yes, it was true. And Proctor fits into all this area where it was all hidden away, and certainly I have had, and I've not really been able to confirm a lot of this, but people have come forward with a lot of allegations about that period, suggesting there was much more going on in Parliament, involving, I would say, at least young men. They might now be over they might now be okay, but at the time it would have been illegal, and MPs who were living double lives.
Let's have a listen now to Harvey Proctor, because he was on the TV earlier this week, and this is a programme where he was speaking to one of the presenters, and he decided that he didn't like what they were saying, their line of questioning, that he didn't feel that they were listening to him enough, and walked out of the studio. So let's have a listen to Harvey Proctor earlier this week.
By showing photographs to Mr. Beech of children that I'm supposed to have murdered could have got in the way of any criminal action that was taken against me. No, it's all right, you're talking across me, but that's because the BBC are very sensitive about any criticism whatsoever that may come your way.
I will continue this conversation.
By talking across me, you're not really doing what the BBC should do, and that is to give a right to comment. And you're very sensitive about this. I understand that. I understand the BBC is sensitive in view of the criticism that not just the police but the BBC has received in Henrique's report yesterday.
The IOPC has also found out there was no evidence regarding lying or deliberate wrongdoing by Cressida Dick, as you have just said. They also looked at the conduct. They also looked at. Please let me talk, and I will let you talk. This is how this works.
You've just said that the IOPC have found no evidence of Cressida Dick lying. Hold on. The IOPC have not interviewed Cressida Dick.
Okay.
They didn't know that she was involved. In fact, Sir Richard Henriques didn't know that she was involved. She wasn't interviewed by Sir Richard Henriques. Invite Cressida Dick onto your programme. Invite me onto the programme too, and let's have a debate about it. She won't come.
Sir Richard has also. I want to get to how this has impacted you, but I need to do my job as well and say Sir Richard.
I
Richard has
respect your work. I respect your work very much, but you must not interview. You must not invite people onto your programme and then not allow them to speak.
I am allowing you to speak, and I will allow you to speak.
You are
but
now,
I also
but you
need
weren't before.
I also need to give a right of reply rather than letting you say things that are potentially incorrect or when people don't have a right to reply.
I'm not having this. I'm sorry.
Harvey Proctor, thank you for your time. Harvey Proctor, former Conservative MP, and I think what's made very clear there is the impact that this investigation has had on his life, as he said at the very beginning, how it's impacted on his life. Harvey Proctor talking to us this morning, former Conservative MP.
As he walks out of the studio, what do you make of incidents like that, David?
Well, I mean, he obviously feels, I would imagine what it is that he's not been, I mean, he was very much in the limelight in the 1980s and 90s, and he obviously got a job well away from Westminster and everything else, and then to find himself at the centre of an investigation. But the problem is that the police had to investigate this. I mean, if it was the other way round, and the police were given information by a person at the time, it was only proved later to be basically to have made up the stuff that he said, there would be a furore if it leaked out that the Met Police were covering up allegations about children being murdered just because they were prominent people involved. And I think the reason why the Met probably did pursue this at the time was that because if you go back to Savile, at the time, people, didn't believe it and everything else. And then, one's only got to look at the report by Dame Janet Smith, who did the report on the BBC stuff and what came out there. That basically people just turned a blind eye to it, and because he was Jimmy Savile and famous, they didn't do anything, or they didn't believe any of the people. And I think the police feel fairly badly that actually at the time that this was, that in fact people didn't get justice. So, I can well understand him being furious, I'm dragged into all this and the other. But on the other hand, the police did have a job to do, and if they covered it up, there would have been the stories would all be the other way at the moment.
We've also seen, haven't we, since all this?
If you were important, that nothing happened.
Yeah, so we've also seen since this the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, and I find it staggering that Ghislaine Maxwell, who clearly was a sex trafficker, seems to be still walking the streets. One wonders, doesn't one, when the police are looking at subjects like this, whether they, like some journalists, simply say this is too difficult to deal with, let's just walk away.
Well, because it's such a contentious subject, and because these people are wealthy, and I'm not particularly saying Harvey Proctor is, but basically have a lot of resources, and because of the libel laws and other things, I think actually probably journalists probably are very careful, and because it's a very difficult thing, if I come back to my original thing, to prove, because it's often done in private secret and they've gone to great lengths to cover things up, you are left with, journalists can do anything. In fact, I had some comments sent to me saying that, well, after the Carl Beech thing, journalists shouldn't cover anything that comes from a sort of child abuse survivor. They shouldn't investigate at all unless the police are, have investigated. They should just report what the decision is and just turn the people away. And I actually don't think that's right either, actually. Because a lot of the people are, and it's coming out in the child sex, the independent inquiry there, a lot of people, it does take quite a lot of courage for them to come out and talk about their experiences, and also because if it happens to them when they're very young, they often don't understand it at all.
Anyway, as it is such a difficult subject, David,
and also then they become damaged, then they get, or some of them get into crime and other things. So anybody, if they make any accusations, say, oh well, he's just a criminal trying to make money. And this makes sort of an investigation actually quite difficult. But I don't think journalists should just forget about it and say if someone comes to them, oh, sorry, no, if you're an abuse survivor, it's too difficult, we can't possibly look at it.
David, where can people find some decent information on this? Because it clearly is, I mean, there still seems to be some unexplained circumstances at Elm Guest House and elsewhere, and this is certainly not going to go away, particularly since this inquiry is going to be running on. Where's a good place to find out more about this? And maybe you can also plug your own website.
Yes, because I did one story, because it was always said that there was some suggestion that Carole Kasir and that list and everything else, whether she died, whether she just died normally, or whether actually there's more to it. And I mean, this is a good example of something. And then one of my sources discovered that, contrary to what was being said, that at the hearing into her death, at the coroner's report, far from the papers not being there, they were there, and after a lot of badgering managed to get them. And you then get little interesting pieces, like her GP, who'd known her for 20 years, said she wasn't the type of person to commit suicide, as suggested, and you sort of wonder. And also, we're also back, I mean, the establishment is still, I mean, I'm at the moment trying to work on a story about, there's been a recent new biography of Lord and Lady Mountbatten, which is written by a decent historian, Andrew Lowney, which goes into their whole life and also contains an interesting chapter about rumours about that not only was Lord both of them have different lovers, but actually Lord Mountbatten was bisexual and even possibly alleged from one or two people of paedophile. Now, one of the connections is Kincora, which is a notorious place in Belfast where various people were abused, and it's important people. And he was supposed to be released official information, which is still held in the National Archives, about the inquiry into it in 1985, correspondence and other things. And suddenly, the authorities wouldn't allow him under a freedom of information because they said it was going to be published, then changed their mind. And the Northern Ireland Department is still sitting on stuff that goes back 40 years, and it's referred it to an advisory committee, but it means a further delay. And so to get and stand things up, you're not helped by a reticence of government to hide things, which is, and what are we talking about, 40 years, and we've got a 20-year rule now. They're still being held back.
Good God, I mean, it's amazing.
I wonder whether it is because they don't want any
the cover-up continues.
They allege there were investigations of important people.
The cover-up continues,
and
David.
it's extremely unfair to the victims.
Yeah, David.
Because they just don't get any justice or allowed to see the full papers.
David, the cover-up continues. Where do you think most headway may be made? Do you think through the criminal justice system or through the press? Because it seems to be that both of them are on the back foot at the moment.
They are, and I think we've gone through a period where it's, first of all, the time this actually happened, you know, the time, if you remember, it's not just the organisation I was working for, Exaro News, looking at this, but all the nationals were almost competing with each other for more amazing stories about, you know, child sex abuse involving prominent people in the wake of Savile and all that. And now they've gone the complete opposite way and saying, well, actually, all these, because of Carl Beech, all these allegations are probably untrue, and we're not going to touch it. And I think, unfortunately, we're probably going to go through a year or so before actually papers will come back and start raising issues. I mean, the good sign is that decent police forces are getting a lot of local coverage when they expose things. I mean, if one looks at the number of paedophile rings that they've been convicted recently in Stoke-on-Trent. I mean, as well as the ones that are well known in Rotherham and places like that, and Newcastle and Hull, and that is getting local coverage, which is showing how serious it is, and these people have been convicted, but very little national coverage because of the atmosphere at the moment saying, a lot of these things are probably untrue.
David, what's your website?
Right, thanks.
What's your website, please?
Oh, sorry, my website. My website is Westminster Confidential, and it's at davidhenke.com, actually.
David Henke, thanks very much for joining us on the Politics Show.
Well, thank you very much as well, and I hope it was useful. Okay.
Kevin Carhill's also here, who's worked with David. What do you make of that, Kevin?
David's always been... I've known David for about 40 years, not just since XRO. David's always been one of the most sensible and careful journalists I've ever known. And if David thinks there is a smell, there is. And I hope the media follow him and follow what's still there.
What's your instinct on the question, the last one I asked him, about whether it will be the criminal justice system, the police, or whether it will be the press that makes progress on this issue? Because there's still a lot to uncover. As he's saying, there still things being kept secret which shouldn't be.
Yeah. Well, when all this was happening about 3 years ago, I have a slightly different approach. I use documents, and a report was produced by a barrister and somebody from the NSPCC saying there were no hidden files. Well, a colleague of David's and mine, we went down to Kew, and it took us 1 hour to find 129 investigations into children's homes around London that had been sealed for 70 or 100 years. Again, that was never taken up. But there's a lot of stuff there.
Made in Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.